Professor Graeme McQueen has been a scholar and peace activist for over 3 decades, helping to found the McMaster Center for Peace Studies in 1989. Now, as an editor of the Journal of 9/11 Studies and member of the Toronto Hearings Committee and the 9/11 Consensus Panel, McQueen is looking for ways to go beyond the collection of 9/11 evidence into prosecution for the crimes of September 11, 2001. This is the GRTV feature interview with our special guest, Graeme McQueen.
First thing I did was when I read an article, Explosive Evidence, by David Ray Griffin, which had to do with the New York firefighters and the fact that a lot of them had witnessed explosions in the Twin Towers. He and others, I think probably Todd Fletcher was involved in doing some of the research for that. Anyway, some of them had really spent a lot of time combing through the FDNY oral histories, which had recently been released after a lawsuit by the New York Times against the city of New York. I read that article and was fascinated by it. I thought, if this is right, if all these firefighters say, well, yeah, we saw and heard explosions, the place was being blown apart, then wow, that's really important. Imagine having a formal legal process, an investigation of a crime. Imagine if you had a bunch of eyewitnesses that you were ignoring. It's outrageous. So I just shoved everything on my desk aside. I had projects I was working on. I said, nothing is as important as this. These oral histories have just been recently released. There's about 10,000 pages of them. Most people do not have the time to read that, but I do. And so that was it for the next few months. I read them all, and I counted. I paid attention to how many people talked about explosions. I worked out a method of counting them, what would count and what wouldn't count as an explosion testimony. I didn't want to be interpreting it. I wanted them, the witnesses, to interpret it themselves. So, for example, if they said, well, then I heard a boom, that's not good enough. If they said, then I heard an explosion, that would count. So I did that. And I also tried to look for evidence that contradicted the theory. People that said, for example, that the buildings pancaked down, since that was a very popular theory in the months after 9/11 when the firefighters were being interviewed in the oral histories. Anyway, so I did that work, and that was published in the Journal of 9/11 Studies in 2006. What was it called? 118 witnesses. The firefighters' testimony to explosions in the Twin Towers, something like that. Because I had found 118, which I thought was a lot. I mean, imagine a trial where you have 118 witnesses. That's very strong. And they corroborate each other. In some cases, they're quite detailed testimony. Now, since then, I've worked rather half-heartedly since then to expand that list, because you reach a certain point of diminishing returns. If people can poo-poo 118, then they're not, they're not going to have any trouble with 156, which is my current list. But anyway, I will probably briefly in my talk show the chart of 156 and give 2 specific witnesses as an example of how one witness can corroborate the testimony of another. And I would say that that article is still the one that I'm most known for in the movement, simply because I was the one who was there at that historical moment, who had the opportunity to read them all and to do that, and to get to those very important documents first. Not first, but early on. And I won't spend so much time on the work that I did subsequent to that, but every time I wrote 4 main research articles, all of them published in the Journal of 9/11 Studies, and each time I thought, what is a key point in the official story that I could knock out? Because by this point, of course, I was convinced, I was thoroughly convinced through my own research, the official narrative was false. So what are the key points that I can knock out? I'm not an architect, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a physicist, I can't do all that work, but there's some things I can do. I can read oral histories, for example, so on. So I ended up writing 3 other articles, and each one, it seemed to me, touched on a key element in the official story. So one had to do with foreknowledge of building 7's collapse. It turns out there were hundreds of people who knew it was going to come down before it came down. Some of them knew 4 hours before it came down. And yet it was the first such collapse in history. Well, think about it. That's a problem. It's impossible to know about a unique event before it happens, an event that's unprecedented. And when there are so many people who know, to say it's fishy is to understate the case. Moreover, they didn't just suspect it was coming down. Many of them say they knew it was coming down because authorities had told them it was definitely coming down. They had been told where to stand, some of them. They talked about standing around for a couple of hours waiting for 7 to come down, which is why I entitled that article Waiting for 7. You're waiting for an unprecedented event? So that's an important topic. And that's a fairly dry article, but I think it was important. The other two, one of them was I became intrigued during a discussion with some bloggers about the way the North Tower came down. As I say, I'm not a physicist, but on the other hand, I took physics in grade 9, so I know the rudimentary things about free fall and so on. I don't think you have to have a PhD in physics to grasp the basic point that an object in free fall through the air will have a different acceleration profile than one that impacts an enormously strong steel structure. Now, when we actually look at the North Tower coming down, it doesn't come down as quickly as if it were in free fall acceleration, but there is no change in the rate of acceleration when the top part of the building supposedly impacts the bottom part. Now, the official story of the National Institute of Standards and Technology is that when that top rigid part of the building came down, due to fire and buckling of columns and so on, it fell onto the lower structure and caused its total and complete and rapid collapse. Well, I'm sorry, but if that top part is going to cause any such event, it is going to have to slow down. There's no way around it. This is a necessary deceleration, and it's not there. And so again, I don't have a PhD in physics, but I knew how to break the video into frames, and I knew how to tell what the rate of acceleration was. And when it came to writing that article, I needed to have an engineer to write it with me, and I asked Tony Zambotti if he would. He's an engineer from New Jersey, wonderful guy. And we wrote that article, which I think, again, is an article that proves, really, that the official narrative of how those buildings came down is false. Obviously, the lower structure was destroyed by some other agency. It wasn't destroyed by the top of the building. And the final article was the one in which I guess I took the biggest risk, because it has to do with the shaking of the earth when the South Tower came down, that whole seismic issue. There's the seismographs that show us the various profiles of what supposedly happened at the World Trade Center. And these were measured at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. And although I'm not a seismologist, I began to think there was something deeply wrong about the conclusions they had come to. That they thought that the big signals were caused when the tower hit the ground. And it's perfectly clear from a variety of sources that that the earth was shaking well before anything hit the ground. And indeed, before the building even visibly began to come down. And so in that article, I assembled quite a bit of evidence to show that. And I might add that in the next couple of weeks, we expect an article to be published in the Journal of 9/11 Studies by a guy who does have the credentials and has worked in the field of seismology, who analyzes those seismograms in considerable depth and comes to more radical conclusions than I did. That the signals that were supposedly caused by the planes hitting the towers, he said, were not caused by that. They were caused by explosions. And that the subsequent big signals, which supposedly were from the buildings coming down, 1, 2, and 7, were all caused by explosions. That they simply do not have the right signature for what supposedly caused them. And they don't have the right timing either. He says it's clear that the explosion which caused the first signals, the supposed plane impact, unfortunately happened 15 seconds before the planes struck the building. So I feel to some extent justified in some of the conclusions that I reached. So those are the research articles, and you get to a certain point where you say, okay, I could keep doing this for the rest of my life because this is such a big fraud. I could keep finding research projects. It's interesting to do research, but at some point, and I reached this previously in peace studies too, you get to the point where you say, you know what, we've got enough evidence. What we need to do now is public education. We need to do advocacy. We need to make the right films, have the right hearings, get the legal process started, all these things. It's not good enough to continue doing research in my office. And so it was after that time I began kind of joining other organizations. I helped put on the Toronto hearings on 9/11, which I think were important and will continue to be important, especially now that the hearings report has finally been published. Joined the 9/11 consensus panel and became co-editor of the Journal of 9/11 Studies. In all cases, I think I'm playing a role, but it's not the role primarily of a researcher. It's the role of a thinker, an advocate, an organizer. Not always fun roles, but they're necessary. Well, this is a tricky question because on the one hand, as somebody who is an anti-war activist and peace research guy, it's perfectly clear that 9/11 was a trigger event. It triggered wars, specific individual wars and invasions. It also helped to keep alive the institution of war, which is in great disrepute at the moment in the world. Wars have been declining steadily for some time now. And 9/11 helped kickstart that ancient and brutal institution again, because there are always certain people who profit from it. So from that point of view, I would like the 9/11 Truth Movement to understand this, to understand what war is, what it does, what trigger events are, how 9/11 fits within that, how the 9/11 Truth Movement can fit within that broad historical peace movement, which in my view has been in existence for 2,500 years. So that's one part of the story. And of course many people in the Truth Movement already do understand that, but I would like to see it more widely understood. On the other hand, I'm very careful not to try and make 9/11 Truth just part of my particular vision and my particular ideology. I mean, I've been a peace activist all my adult life. I've been on the left ideologically all my life. I know, though, that the 9/11 Truth Movement is an eccentric and very diverse movement. People all over the place ideologically. There's former intelligence officers, former military officers. I don't spurn them or have contempt for them. I welcome them. I welcome this broad ideological diversity of the movement. I don't want to start purging people because they don't agree with my analysis. And so that's where it gets tricky. I think we want to show people political contexts within which we interpret 9/11. We want, as well as we can, to persuade them. You know, this is morally correct, we need to do this. But at the same time, to honor that diversity, which is the hallmark of this movement. I've been in lots of social movements before. I've never been in one as odd, eccentric, and diverse as this one. It's a wild and woolly beast. There's not everybody in the 9/11 Truth Movement is someone I would want to link arms with and walk down the street with a banner, frankly. But on the other hand, it's a creative movement. I mean, the peace movement in the world, certainly in the West, is in terrible shape right now. In comparison, the 9/11 Truth Movement is a young, energetic, creative movement. It creates its own songs. It has its own kind of street activists, its own renegade journalists. It has wacky theories sometimes as well, but that doesn't bother me too much. It apparently has some racists in it, which does bother me, and we need to denounce and marginalize. But that's what happens in a social movement. There's no card, there's no membership. So you can't just kick people out you don't like. On the whole, I glory in the diversity of it. And so that's the balance we need to strike. Well, certainly what's happening in Malaysia fits within my particular program very well. As I say, I decided, okay, we've done the research, let's get on to some practical activities that will help make the people who did 9/11, to make them accountable for the crime. And if we can't nab the individuals, then at least to lay bare what happened and to discredit the institutions, at least, that collaborated. How do we do that? Well, the Toronto hearings were a major event in the sense that it took us about a year to organize them, and they were part of that program. Now the question is, where do you go from there? Well, we thought about that all along, of course. We knew that we couldn't subpoena people, we couldn't bring people to court, but it was a necessary first step. Well, there are a number of routes we can go now. One of the people who was on the panel of the 9/11 hearings, Judge Ferdinando Imposimato from Italy, wants to take the issue to the International Criminal Court. I think we should support him. We should try that. At the same time, the war crimes tribunals in Malaysia exist in part because of a certain cynicism toward the ICC, that the ICC will never bring to justice the biggest criminals in the world, that it will not touch the George Bushes and so on of the world, and therefore there needs to be another forum, and I respect that. So we have these two possible paths. One is the more mainstream, the International Criminal Court. One is the less mainstream, the Kuala Lumpur tribunals. I think we should try them both. Do I think Mr. Imposimato is going to be successful with the ICC? No, but I think we ought to give him a chance. In the meantime, we don't just sit around waiting. We make use of this forum, and we appreciate the openness of the people in the Perdana Global Peace Foundation to this issue. And I just applaud them for being willing to put this on. We also have to realize that maybe if the Western media are going to continue to ignore this, not just the media, Western media ignore what's happening in Malaysia, Western universities ignore these tribunals, Western politicians ignore these tribunals, too bad, but they don't constitute the majority of people in the world. If what's happening in Malaysia can be widely broadcast in Asia, for example, or in the non-aligned movement, or in what's called the Global South, these are all huge, important forums. If the Western media is going to continue to cut all this out, in the end, that's their problem. But in the meantime, we can aim to have the majority of people in the world wake up to this. And so we need to think about that. Who's our audience? How do we reach them? And whatever we do, we don't want to put on an event here that is just seen by a few hundred people. We need to think right from the outset how to make it seen and understood by the widest possible audience. There's about 10,000 pages of them. Most people do not have the time to read that, but I do. And so that was it for the next few months. I read them all and I counted, I paid attention to how many people talked about explosions. I worked out a method of counting them, what would count and what wouldn't count as an explosion testimony. I didn't want to be interpreting it. I wanted them, the witnesses, to interpret it themselves. So, for example, if they said, well, then I heard a boom, that's not good enough. If they said, then I heard an explosion, fighters say, well, yeah, we saw and heard explosions. The place was being blown apart. Then, wow, that's really important. Imagine having a formal legal process, an investigation of a crime. Imagine if you had a bunch of eyewitnesses that you were ignoring. It's outrageous. So I just shoved everything on my desk aside. I had projects I was working on. I said, nothing is as important as this. These oral histories have just been recently released.
Professor Graeme McQueen has been a scholar and peace activist for over 3 decades, helping to found the McMaster Center for Peace Studies in 1989. Now, as an editor of the Journal of 9/11 Studies and member of the Toronto Hearings Committee and the 9/11 Consensus Panel, McQueen is looking for ways to go beyond the collection of 9/11 evidence into prosecution for the crimes of September 11, 2001. This is the GRTV feature interview with our special guest, Graeme McQueen.
First thing, explosion, that would count. So I did that. And I also tried to look for evidence that contradicted the theory. People that said, for example, that the buildings pancaked down, since that was a very popular theory in the months after 9/11 when the firefighters were being interviewed in the oral histories. Anyway, so I did that work, and that was published in the Journal of 9/11 Studies in 2006. What was it called? 118 witnesses. The firefighters' testimony to explosion. I did was when I read an article, Explosive Evidence, by David Ray Griffin, which had to do with the New York firefighters and the fact that a lot of them had witnessed explosions in the Twin Towers. He and others, I think probably Todd Fletcher was involved in doing some of the research for that. Anyway, some of them had really spent a lot of time combing through the FDNY oral histories, which had recently been released after a lawsuit by the New York Times against the city of New York. I read that article and was fascinated by it. I thought, if this is right, if all these